You know that feeling?
Mhm.
You reach for your phone almost without thinking, maybe to check the news, even when the last 10 times left you feeling kind of drained.
Or that urge, yeah, that quick click buy now on something you just saw online.
Exactly. So let's try and unpack what's actually happening in your brain in those moments.
Yeah.
We're diving deep into the world of neuroscience today, and the star of our show is dopamine.
It's really fascinating, isn't it, how these sort of ingrained digital habits we've all developed,
Hmm.
like the endless scroll through negative headlines, what people call doom scrolling,
Right.
and just the constant pull of instant online gratification, how they directly tap into our brain's dopamine system.
Yeah, and we've got some pretty compelling material to explore today.
We do. We'll be looking at insights into how dopamine drives desire, drawing from the Huberman Lab stuff,
Okay.
and also a report that pulls together current neuroscience research on, how these digital behaviors really impact us neurologically.
Exactly. So our mission here with this deep dive is to really get under the skin of these behaviors. Like, what are the unseen effects on our day-to-day motivation, our general well-being?
Mhm.
And maybe most importantly, what does the science actually suggest? Are, concrete steps we can take to regain some control?
Yeah, aiming for clear, practical understanding. No need for a PhD here.
Definitely not. We'll keep the jargon down.
So maybe let's start by laying the groundwork. Dopamine and this fundamental idea of desire. The Huberman Lab clips actually illustrate this pretty well, talking about dopamine activity as a kind of
A
waves.
wave, yeah. Think of like you get this surge, right? A peak of dopamine.
Yeah,
But what comes next is just as crucial.
right.
There's a drop that often goes even lower than your normal baseline level.
It's like every high has this little corresponding low that follows it.
Exactly.
And that low point, that dip below baseline, that's really what seems to motivate us, to push us to seek out whatever it is we're craving.
Okay, so it's the drop that fuels the surge.
It seems to be a major driver. And here's where it gets, I think, really interesting. Dopamine isn't just released when we get the thing we want.
Mm.
It actually starts flowing in anticipation of getting it, just thinking about it.
Right. They used that great example, didn't they?
Mm.
Really, really wanting a specific roast beef sandwich. You
Yeah.
start picturing that tangy sourdough bread, the melting Swiss cheese, maybe some juicy tomatoes, a perfect crunchy pickle.
You're making me hungry just describing it.
Ah, but yeah, just the thought of that perfect sandwich, boom, dopamine levels start to climb.
It's that mental image, the expectation that gets the whole process going.
Okay.
And that anticipation, that dopamine surge, it's not just a feeling. If we connect this to the bigger picture, it's directly linked to our motivation to actually move, to take the steps needed to, go get that sandwich or order that book or achieve whatever goal you've set.
So there's a movement component linked to dopamine too.
Exactly. There's a whole separate dopamine circuit involved in initiating movement. So it makes sense that desire and the urge to act are so tightly connected. It's not just a coincidence.
So we start seeing this cycle then.
Mm-hmm.
A desire pops up, maybe triggered by something
Mm-hmm.
that gives you a dopamine peak, which then leads to that inevitable dip below baseline.
Right.
And that dip is what fuels you to take action to pursue the thing,
Yeah. And as you go about your day, you encounter cues or triggers in the environment.
like seeing a deli sign if you're craving that sandwich.
Precisely. And those cues themselves can provide a little jolt of dopamine, almost like a signal saying you're on the right track, even before you get the final reward.
Interesting. It kind of keeps you going.
It can, yeah. And this leads us nicely into another really insightful concept called reward prediction error.
Reward prediction error. Okay, what's that?
It's basically the difference your brain calculates between the reward you expected to get and the reward you actually received.
Okay, so back to the sandwich. Let's say it turns out exactly like I imagined. Good, satisfying, but, not earth-shattering.
Then your dopamine levels will likely just return pretty smoothly to your normal baseline. The expectation matched the reality.
But what if it's the best sandwich I've ever tasted? Like unexpectedly amazing.
Then you'll likely experience a much bigger dopamine peak than your brain had initially predicted based on past sandwiches. That positive surprise really reinforces the behavior that led you there.
Makes you want to go back to that deli again.
Exactly. But on the flip side, what if the deli's suddenly closed? Or the sandwich is just stale and disappointing?
Oh, the worst.
Then your dopamine level might actually drop even further below your baseline than it was during the craving phase. The reality fell short of the prediction.
So it's like our brains are constantly running these little prediction algorithms, these calculations,
Kind of.
mostly beneath our conscious awareness. We just experience it as these sort of context-dependent cravings and the drive to satisfy them.
Precisely. And while we're not consciously thinking, oh, my dopamine just dipped, the prefrontal cortex, the part of our brain involved in planning and higher level thinking, is crucial. It helps set the context for these cravings and guides our actions towards the goal.
It's a pretty efficient system when you think about it, designed to propel us toward things we need or desire.
Absolutely. Survival oriented at its core.
Okay, so that gives us a good handle on the basic dopamine framework. Now let's bring in doom scrolling. This term really blew up, didn't it? Especially during the pandemic and other uncertain times.
It really did. And it seems counterintuitive, right? Why would we get hooked on endlessly scrolling through negative news?
Yeah, what's the neurological hook there?
Well, the report we looked at points out that even though doom scrolling exposes us to negative, often upsetting content, the act itself still triggers dopamine release.
Really? Even with bad news?
It appears so. It creates this potentially addictive cycle. And we also have to consider the role of social media algorithms
Oh
here.
yeah, the algorithms.
They are incredibly sophisticated at keeping us engaged, feeding us a continuous stream of content that's often negative, but highly personalized and attention-grabbing.
So even though it might make us feel anxious or depressed afterwards, there's still that underlying dopamine hit during the scrolling itself. That seems paradoxical.
It does seem paradoxical, but if we link this back to some fundamental drives, the drive to seek out new information, novelty,
Correct?
that seeking behavior itself, even if the information turns out to be negative, can cause a dopamine spike. It's almost like our brains have this ancient mechanism that rewards us for staying informed about potential threats, maybe?
Like a vigilance mechanism gone into overdrive?
Possibly, yeah. So the act of seeking, the novelty of the next headline, the slight possibility of some crucial update that might be what reinforces the doom scrolling habit, even when the content itself is distressing.
You can almost feel that sometimes, can't you? That pull for just one more scroll, one more piece of information.
Absolutely. Think about the last time you found yourself mindlessly scrolling news. Can you maybe recognize that feeling, that anticipation for the next item driving it?
Yeah, I think I can. And it's not just the bad news cycle, is it? The report also talks about instant gratification more broadly. Things like, constantly checking social media, making quick online purchases.
Right. That operates on the same fundamental mechanism. Dopamine release happens when we engage in activities that give us that immediate reward, that quick pleasure hit.
Which historically was probably pretty useful for survival, right? Finding food quickly, reacting fast.
Exactly. Our brains are naturally wired to seek those quick rewards. It was essential. The problem arises now with the sheer abundance and constant availability of these instant hits in our modern digital world.
It's like our evolved systems are just overwhelmed.
Completely overwhelmed. There's a quote in there from a neuroscientist, Ilya Monosov, that really captures it. He says something like, people's brains aren't well equipped to deal with the information age. And he suggests our current lifestyles could literally be resculpting the circuits in our brain.
That's a pretty powerful thought. Resculpting our brains.
It really highlights the mismatch, doesn't it? Our brains evolved in a vastly different information environment, and now they're facing this constant barrage of stimuli that can essentially hijack those reward pathways we've been talking about.
Now, the report also mentioned that this isn't uniform, right? We don't all react the same way.
Mm-hmm.
Something about baseline dopamine levels in different control systems.
Yes, exactly. There's research suggesting that individual differences in, say, baseline dopamine levels in certain brain areas might influence how we regulate our behavior.
Okay.
It touches on two types of control, model-based and model-free. Think of model-based as more goal-directed conscious control, like deciding I need to check my email for that specific work update.
Right, purposeful.
Whereas model-free control is more habitual, almost automatic, like grabbing your phone and scrolling through social media without even really thinking about why.
The mindless scroll.
Pretty much. And the idea is that 50 people with naturally higher baseline dopamine in certain regions might lean more towards that goal-directed, model-based control.
Interesting. So our inherent brain chemistry might make some of us more susceptible to these compulsive loops than others.
That seems to be part of the picture, yes. It's complex, but it suggests our individual neurobiology plays a role. It makes you think about your own tendencies, doesn't it? Are you generally more deliberate online, or do you sometimes find yourself scrolling without a clear purpose?
Definitely something to reflect on.
Mm-hmm.
And there was also that research mentioned, I think, from the journal Neuron, about specific brain areas lighting up when we seek info about negative things.
That's right. It wasn't just about seeking positive rewards.
So it's not just chasing pleasure.
No. It seems the same neural circuits that motivate us to seek out positive experiences, like that sandwich,
Mhm.
can also be activated when we specifically look for negative news or information about potential threats.
Why would that be?
Well, one theory is that it relates to a fundamental drive to reduce uncertainty. Even if the information is bad, knowing might feel somehow better or more controllable than not knowing.
Oh, okay. Managing uncertainty.
Exactly. And this research even hints at potential links to conditions like OCD or anxiety, where you often see excessive information seeking related to perceived threats.
So for some people, the discomfort of the unknown, even if the known is bad, might trigger that same dopamine-driven seeking behavior.
That's one interpretation of the findings, yeah. It's a fascinating angle.
Okay, so we have this constant cycle, this potential hijacking of our dopamine system through doom scrolling, instant gratification. What are the potential longer-term consequences? What does this do to our mental well-being, our brain function overall?
Well, the report suggests that this continuous exposure, this constant up and down of the dopamine cycle, could potentially alter our baseline dopamine function over time. Meaning, while we get those temporary spikes, the overall long-term effect might actually contribute to increased feelings of anxiety and depression, especially when negative news is the main focus.
So the quick hits don't necessarily lead to lasting happiness.
Not necessarily, no. And there's also the issue of adaptation or tolerance. Our brains can adapt to this constant stimulation.
Like needing more and more to get the same effect.
Exactly. It might mean we need more intense stimulation or more frequent engagement, more scrolling, more notifications, more purchases, just to achieve the same level of dopamine release, the same feeling of reward.
It sounds like that hedonic treadmill idea, running faster just to stay in the same place, satisfaction-wise.
That's a very good analogy for it. And relying so heavily on these immediate, often superficial rewards can really start to undermine our ability to pursue longer-term goals.
How so?
Well, things that require patience, effort, delayed gratification, like learning a skill, working on a challenging project, building strong relationships, those things might start to feel less appealing or even harder to initiate if our brains are constantly seeking the next quick hit.
It could impact our decision-making, maybe our overall mental resilience.
Yes, potentially creating a kind of dependence on these instant rewards, which comes at the expense of cultivating the skills needed for more meaningful, long-term satisfaction.
And social media seems so woven into this whole fabric. It feels almost perfectly designed to keep us chasing these dopamine hits.
It really does, doesn't it? The constant stream of new content, the potential for social validation through likes and comments, the endless comparison.
Yeah, the comparison trap.
It all feeds into this environment where we're constantly in a state of wanting, of seeking that next little jolt of connection or novelty or validation. The report even talks about the social media amplification effect.
Amplification effect.
Yeah, where the very act of scrolling through this curated, often idealized content becomes its own reward mechanism, mediated by dopamine, regardless of whether the content itself is actually making us feel good or connected in a genuine way.
Wow. So just the scrolling itself becomes the reward loop.
It can, yeah. The behavior reinforces itself.
Okay, this is all sounding a little bit bleak. Is there hope? The report mentioned neuroplasticity, right?
Yes, absolutely. And that is the crucial counterpoint to all of this. It's incredibly important.
So what is neuroplasticity again, just briefly?
It's the brain's amazing ability to change and adapt, to reorganize itself by forming new neural connections throughout life.
So we're not just stuck with the brain wiring we have now.
Not at all. Neuroplasticity means we have the capacity to essentially rewire our responses. We can develop better self-control. We can reshape these dopamine response patterns through conscious effort and practice.
Okay, that's encouraging. So it's not a fixed state. We can actually change how our brains react to these digital triggers.
That's the promise, yes. And the research highlights things like mindfulness practices and cognitive behavioral strategies. These can help strengthen the neural pathways linked to our executive functions, things like planning, impulse control, decision-making.
So by consciously thinking about our choices, maybe understanding the long-term benefits of not instantly gratifying an urge.
Exactly. We can actually strengthen our ability to delay gratification. We can build up that muscle in the brain, so to speak.
Okay. There was also a quick mention of dopamine precursors, like LDOP, and how they might affect things.
Right, that research is interesting. It shows that tweaking overall dopamine levels can influence whether we rely more on that deliberate goal-directed control system versus the habitual one.
Uh,
But crucially, the effects seem to depend quite a lot on a person's initial baseline dopamine
so
levels.
it's not like a simple fix, like taking a pill cures doom scrolling.
Definitely not. It underscores the complexity and the need for personalized approaches if you're looking at pharmacological interventions, which isn't really our focus here. But it does highlight, again, how central dopamine is to these control mechanisms.
Right. So focusing on what we can do, what are some practical, evidence-based strategies that the report suggests? Things you or I could start implementing to break free from these cycles.
Okay, yeah, practical steps. The report outlines several good ones. One is the idea of strategic dopamine fasting.
Fasting, like cutting it out completely.
Not necessarily completely, but intentionally taking breaks. Setting aside specific periods with significantly reduced digital stimulation, reduced exposure to those quick hits. The idea is to help reset your reward sensitivity a bit.
Okay, like a digital detox period.
Sort of, yeah, but maybe more targeted and strategic. Another key one is modifying your environment.
How so?
Simple things, really. Adjusting your phone's notification settings, turning off non-essentials, setting screen time limits for specific apps, even just physically putting your devices somewhere less accessible, especially during certain times.
Out of sight, out of mind. Or at least harder to reach impulsively.
Exactly. Remove the immediate temptation, increase the friction.
Makes sense. What else?
Cultivating alternative sources of reward is really important too.
Finding other things that give you that dopamine hit, but maybe in a healthier way.
Precisely. Engaging in activities that provide more sustained, maybe more profound satisfaction. Things like exercise, getting into a creative hobby, spending quality time in real-world social interactions.
Diversifying your dopamine portfolio, maybe?
Huh. I like that. Yeah, diversifying your sources of genuine reward.
Okay. What about when you're already kind of caught in the scroll? Like you realize you've been doom scrolling for 10 minutes. Any tips there?
That's where metacognitive awareness training comes in handy.
Metacognitive.
Just means thinking about your own thinking. Learning to recognize the feelings, the thoughts, the physical sensations that usually come right before you start compulsively scrolling.
Catching the triggers.
Exactly. Noticing that urge rising, noticing the context. That awareness itself can help you pause and interrupt the cycle before it really gets going.
Just noticing it gives you a bit of space to choose differently.
It can, yes. And finally, the report mentions practicing delayed gratification in small, manageable ways.
Like what?
Intentionally introducing small delays. Maybe waiting an extra 10 or 15 minutes before checking your phone first thing in the morning. Or if you feel an impulse to buy something online, maybe waiting 24 hours before clicking purchase.
Building that muscle again.
Right? These small acts of intentional delay can gradually strengthen your overall impulse control over time.
Okay, so let's try and tie this all together. We've looked at how this dopamine system, which is fundamental to desire and motivation, can get sort of hijacked by modern digital habits like doom scrolling and the constant chase for instant online rewards.
Yeah, creating these potentially problematic cycles.
And we've touched on how this might impact our baseline dopamine function, maybe contributing to anxiety or depression and making it harder to focus on long-term goals.
Right. But crucially, we also talked about neuroplasticity. Our brains can change.
Yeah, that's the hopeful part. We're not just stuck.
Definitely not. And we discussed practical strategies, things like dopamine fasting, changing our environment, finding alternative rewards, building awareness, and practicing small delays.
Things that can empower us to actually regain some control over these habits.
Exactly. And just gaining this understanding, knowing why these urges happen, seeing the neurological mechanisms at play, that itself is a really powerful first step.
It helps frame it not as some kind of personal failing, right, but more as a natural brain response to a very unnatural, stimulating environment.
Precisely. It removes some of the self-blame and opens the door to constructive change.
So for you, the listener, maybe here's something to chew on this week. Think about one or two small ways you could intentionally introduce a bit of a delay in your own pursuit of digital rewards.
Just a small experiment.
Maybe it's waiting just 15 extra minutes before that first social media check in the morning. Or perhaps holding off on that non-essential online purchase until tomorrow, just to see how it feels.
Observe what happens. Notice any shifts, maybe in your cravings or even in your ability to focus on other things.
Yeah. And maybe explore one of those other strategies we talked about, adjusting notifications, finding a non-digital hobby. See what resonates. It's all about finding what could potentially bring a bit more balance back to your digital life and maybe help your dopamine system work for you rather than against you in the long run.